Thank you, Leo. That's no exaggeration to say we have a long history here. In fact, it goes back even before Ranch A. When my grandfather came to Wyoming from eastern South Dakota.
Hold the mic closer now.
A little more? Okay, thank you. When my grandfather came to Wyoming from eastern South Dakota, he went over south of Sundance, and one of the fellows there, the English settled that area, and Oakley Banks really took my grandfather under his wing. The Banks and Smith families were friends forever. And so when the hay was in, then everybody'd come down Sand Creek, camp and fish. Well, they came down through Mosque area and then down Grand Canyon into here. When Mo Annenberg bought this property, Granddad said, you know, that rich Easterner's bought this, and he's going to lock it up. We won't be able to get to Sand Creek. At that time, it came down rather than go around by the highway. Oakley was chairman of the Board of County Commissioners, so they got the road in pretty fast. And when Mo Annenberg found out about it, he wasn't too happy with Nels Smith. Over the years, somehow, that got healed. But so when Mo died, Granddad was asked to buy Ranch A. And when the request came in, he said, I couldn't make any offer I could make on that would be an insult. He said, it's out of the question. And the rest of the story as it evolved was that, now this was from the Annenberg estate, Mo was dead. You need to know that Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon did not invent using the Internal Revenue Service to prosecute and persecute their political enemies. Franklin Roosevelt was a master at it, and he was after a lot of people, not only Mo Annenberg. You'd get the impression from that, but he went so far as to prosecute and put on trial Andrew Mellon, the former Secretary of Treasury, who was acquitted after trial. It was that vicious. Mo Annenberg had a tremendous, in addition to the racing for him, which you hear about, a great cash cow for him. He also was the only major newspaper conservative publisher adamantly opposed to the New Deal. So he was in Roosevelt's crosshairs for sure. Now, Annenberg was not convicted. Mo Annenberg pled guilty to income tax evasion to keep the feds off his son, Walter, because they were going to deal him all the misery they could, and I'll leave it to whether or not how valid the charges were. We'll debate that another time. But nevertheless, Mo wasn't convicted. He pled guilty and was sentenced to prison. And there's another book. This one. I'm sorry.
Hold the mic closer.
Okay, I'll keep kissing this thing. There's another excellent book. This is Legacy, written earlier. And then another one is The Annenbergs, written more recently. This was after Walter was appointed ambassador to Great Britain. But on the cover of that, on the dust cover of that magazine, or of that book, you can see how haggard and drawn he was. It just broke his health. And he was released to die. And Granddad then was approached to buy Ranch A. And what he didn't know was that Walter was desperately struggling to preserve their publishing empire and selling everything else. They had an even more elaborate estate in Pennsylvania called Sunnylands. That name's been now transferred to their property in Palm Springs. But anyhow, Granddad made the offer and got it. Walter was the executor of the estate, and he was under tremendous political pressure. First of all, tremendous pressure, period, financial, because Roosevelt wanted to break that newspaper chain. He did not like the Philadelphia Inquirer having the influence it did, plus the other papers opposing his policies. And they sure weren't real happy about anything being sold to a prominent Republican governor. Nevertheless, Walter honored the deal. When he was appointed, or nominated as ambassador to Great Britain, Granddad wrote a letter to Cliff Hansen, then our senator, and I'll shorten it a bit. The punchline on it was, despite tremendous pressure, Walter Annenberg honored our deal. He's a man of courage and integrity and will serve you well. And he was confirmed. I'm sure there was more to it than Granddad's letter, but nevertheless, he had great respect for Walter Annenberg. When Mo built the place, he had state-of-the-art. These lights, he loved opera. There was a record changer over there that played entire operas on 78s, and it would turn the 3.5 minutes or whatever you could get on a 78 RPM record, turn it over, play the other side, move it aside, and then take the other one. We still have those records, but he loved opera. And that was a special record player. It ran on DC current generated by a hydroelectric plant on site. They took the water in up above, ran it through. There was a combination gravity and pump storage project. The hydro plants right on down below had their own electricity, had their own power line, or had their own phone line. And that was state of the art. Now, supposedly, I don't know this for a fact, but I've heard it enough, I've got to believe it, that somewhere in here there was a teletype machine that got the real-time racing results, as well as the other telecommunications. Well, and that was in connection with his racing form, which I said was a cash cow. You see those old movies where the guy goes up to the window and he's paid a $2 bet and he's got this newspaper in his back pocket? Well, that was the racing form. That was the racing form for sure. And now, and in one of the biographies, boy, are we doing all right? There we go. Okay, I can hear that. I can even hear that myself now. In one of the biographies, you'll hear that Walter was not happy with his father getting into that part of it. Walter, however, had some ideas of his own. He got the idea that a teenage fashion magazine might go, and that was 17, the first of its kind and very successful. I don't know what I'm doing. What am I doing wrong?
No, I'll just hold it. Go ahead.
This is going to be a long-winded presentation.
That's okay.
Okay. And then he got the idea, you know, some places in those days even had 2 and even 3 television stations. So there wasn't much variety. But Walter Annenberg got the idea that maybe people wanted to know what was on, so he took a flyer on this goofy notion that you could publish a thing called TV Guide. Well, that worked reasonably well, you can imagine. Anyhow, back to what all happened. Mo Annenberg was on his way to Yellowstone Park. Car broke down in Spearfish. And help me with this. Who remembers what the hotels were in Spearfish in the 20s? Because I need to know that name. Does anybody know what the hotels were in Spearfish in the 20s? Okay, well, if you do or somebody digs it up, please let me know, because he was staying at one of those hotels while his car was being fixed. He ordered trout, and he fished to feed his family in Germany, East Prussia, and he loved to fish. He said, these are the best trout I've had since I left the old country. Where'd they come from? They came from Sand Creek. Came out here and talked to Mr. LaPlante, who had a fish hatchery and rearing operation just up the creek, and said, I want to come by your place. Well, LaPlante, and I'm making this up based on my best notion of what happened. LaPlante just finally decided to get rid of this pushy Easterner with the accent, so he priced it so high nobody would pay it, and he sold his place. And so that was how that happened, and that was in 1927, 28. And then Annenberg got Ray Ewing, recognized architect. Some of his other work, in addition to here, is on the cabin that just up from Cheyenne Crossing that Bud Kelly had for a while. He designed and built the 76 grandstand, well-known. Architect was a fellow named landscape architect, a fellow named J.R. McKay, and the Jusso brothers were outstanding log builders. There's not a nail in the main construction of this building. There's no caulking, no chinking, as you can see. Those logs are individually cut and then 2 strips of oakum, one outside, one inside, for insulation. And this building does not get a wind through it. I'll guarantee you, I slept in that upstairs bedroom a lot of times. Just phenomenally well built. Now, Mr. Kelly was the caretaker for Annenberg, and he told the story. He stayed on for a while after Granddad got it. I can remember him, but if anybody can tell me Kelly's name and a little more about him, I'd appreciate that too. That would have been about late in early 40s. But he told about Annenberg walking around really down. I mean, this was before the tax troubles and depression was on. But Annenberg hadn't gotten down, but he was really down, walking around out here. Kelly told my grandparents this, probably Granddad, because Granddad loved to fish as well. "What's wrong, Mr. Annenberg?" He said, "It's been so wet, the hoppers haven't hatched. I can't fish." That was his biggest worry, right in the middle of the Depression. Well, let's see, phone line, hydro plant. Interesting, because of that phone line, the independent phone company at Sundance used that for direct communication in Bridget to go into Spearfish. Otherwise, they were pretty well cut off in our little community up there at Sundance. That worked quite nicely. Walter later went on to very generously endow the Annenberg School of Telecommunications at the University of Pennsylvania. Funny how that played out. I did some work with him later on in my life as a regulatory bureaucrat. Right again, we got that. Okay, Granddad bought it, and then he sold his interest to Harold Dittus from Spearfish. I've got to tell you about the other people in here. Bill Walker and Sam Keener were the two people who came in with him on it. Now, Bill sold his interest and went on to build the Saratoga Inn down Saratoga, Wyoming, and some of you may have been there. Sam stayed clear through. But Bill sold his interest to a fellow named Lorenz Iverson. When Ivy came out to look at it, he and Granddad were walking right out there. There were a string of apple trees along the pond. And they talked a little bit, and Granddad said, "Well, Mr. Iverson, you're a Dane." I said, "Well, yes, but how do you know that?" They said, "Well, your accent's just like my father's." "I have no accent." Well, the accent was like my great-grandfather, because they came from ironically, they came from the same community, Hatteslav in Denmark, in Schleswig-Holstein. But amazing coincidence. Ivy was a phenomenal powerhouse of an engineer and a businessman. Those of you who are into Guinness Book of Records know of the Little David howitzer. Now that is the biggest modern gun ever built. That was built in the Mesta plant, 3 of them. Granddad went through, and one of them was under construction. He said there was a man sitting inside, small man, but a man sitting inside the barrel miking the rifle ends. It was built because the Germans were running trains back into the tunnels in the mountains, and then Allies couldn't get to them, and then later on they'd bring the armaments or the troops or whatever out and be essentially behind your lines. Do tremendous damage, had to break those tunnels. Well, the idea was to get a high trajectory of the howitzer, come down, break the tunnels. Went to Ivy, and I got to tell you another story. Ivy went to school, engineering school in Germany. His father reputedly sold the last horse off the farm to pay for him to go to engineering school. But he was overdoing work. You got to know that there were 2 places in that Depression world where there was a lot going on in terms of construction, and one was the Soviet Union, and the other was Nazi Germany. So they were doing a lot of work, and Ivy was over there on contract, and he heard some officers over in the side talking about the cost, and the conversation was, well, what does the cost matter if we're going to war? Well, as soon as he got back to the States, he told the FBI about that, and that matters later on. So they said, we need to break these tunnels. There's so many feet of reinforced concrete, and either 12 or 15 feet. And Ivy told him, no, it's the other number. Well, no, Mr. Iverson, we know it's whatever they were claiming. He said, our intelligence is quite accurate. He said, so is mine. I built them before the war. And they never used them on that. They developed a skip bombing technique where they could take a pilot with a lot of skill and even more guts, fly right straight at the tunnel, drop the bombs, run in there and blow the tunnel up as the plane pulled away. Ivy said that if it weren't for American industry having put away its material, its machinery at the end of World War I, we'd have never been able to fight World War II as well as we did, as early on as it was, and that wasn't too good for the first year and a half. But nevertheless, they were. Now here's one of the things they did at the Mesquite plant. I'm saying this because Ivy was such a part of this operation. Here's the ammunition box. The basement of the Babcock house was full of them. Right now, the ones we have left we use as kind of a king-size banker's box. But that was part of what he did. These fuses are past the gauge from flange to bottom, and they were turning them out by the thousands. So that's where we were. And so anyhow, the new partner to whom Granddad sold could not get along with Ivy nor Sam Keener. Maybe I'll take a little bit of time about Sam Keener. Sam was quite a showman. He was also an industrialist. And he was over in Europe post-war getting orders. And of course, everything was still pretty goosey and touchy because they were still afraid there were some saboteurs and espionage going on. So in '48, somebody said, Sam, you need a uniform. I said, got a uniform, you get through. So here is Sam Keener in Life magazine, 1948. It says, obviously a big shot. That's not a uniform in anything but Sam Keener's airplane, but he said it expedited traffic as passage wherever he went. His plane crew had the same sort of uniform on, worked like a dream. Made Life magazine. Marshal Tito on the front. Part of the construction of this with the Jusos, part of the construction of this building with the Jusos, and you can see the tremendous workmanship. What I doubt very much that you've noticed is that there's 4 inches taken out of every one of these columns with a tool like this. You can't put and if you look real closely, you can see about knee high where that cut was made. You can't put a cigarette paper in anywhere. That's the skill those guys had with a 2-man crosscut. Okay. The new owner, oh, here it is. The new owner didn't get along with Sam and Ivy. Now, being Scandinavian descent myself, mostly Danish, I can say this, it's very politically incorrect. The Scandinavian people are strongly committed to their positions. Now that gives rise to such nasty terms as stubborn Dane. Well, Ivy was sure one of them. He was going to buy Ranch A when it went up for sale. I've got copies of that notice in the Sundance Times. This is one of the things you can take along. But Ivy was going to buy it. Well, and he was out here to do so. Well, at that time, 1952, the rumor was pretty strong that Wyoming was going to legalize gambling. And a couple of guys from Denver, North Denver, showed up. Clyde and Eugene Smaldone. And here's a book I just found recently about them. I mean, this thing's like a real-life Godfather set right in Denver. Well, when you operate on the level that Lorenz Iverson did, worldwide major industrialist, you keep track of what's going on where you have interest. So Ivy obviously knew about those guys. They were up here looking to buy this thing, turn it into a gambling joint, as near as we can put it together, but we definitely know they were here. And just a few days before the sale, by some coincidence, maybe Ivy knew somebody in the FBI, they were arrested. And they didn't quite make it to the auction. But here's the notice of it, and including mention of an inventory done by Edwin Rounds. I have that at home from Dad's papers. Okay, so Ivy says had made up his mind what he'd pay for it. $126,000. That's all he was going. Now he could have outbid anybody, but he quit at 126. Dad went 500 over that and got it. Mother and I were down here for the sale. Granddad wouldn't come. So got back, said, well, who bought it? Well, Dad and his wife. Granddad's response was right up, just instantly, said, what the hell does he want with that? Well, he turned it into Dude Ranch and Conference Center, and that was operated that way by Dad, and also by, I'm not doing that right, was I? You run. That was operated by Dad and the subsequent owners, the Porters. They had Strategic Air Command officers meetings out here. When Granddad was here, it probably was at the golden years of it, of freshly out of politics, and a great friend of John Bricker. John Bricker, you would know if you're a political junkie, was the Republican vice presidential nominee in 1944, and was the author of the Bricker Amendment, which would have strongly protected U.S. interests in foreign countries. It was fiercely resisted by the Nixon administration and defeated in the Senate by one vote. But Granddad and John Bricker were great friends. The families were lifelong friends. When they were governors of Wyoming and Ohio, respectively, that friendship was formed. And there's a picture in those wonderful Fassbender photos. There's a picture of John Bricker raising the flag out here. They had a meeting getting support for what they hoped would be his presidential nomination. There was one, and this is, that I know for a fact, and I believe this to be true. There was one fellow there who they made a little mistake on the guest list, and he was adamantly behind Dewey. Otis Reynolds was a lawyer in Sundance and also the bartender, and after about 2 good strong drinks, that fellow took a nap and they went on with the meeting. But it's just been tremendously interesting. Dad bought it, turned it into Dude Ranch, shown you about Sam Keener's fight at the auction, Small Jones, Ivy. And then the Porters had it, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, U.S. government bought it, Fish and Wildlife Service. And one other thing, gotta tell you about, that pond right back there is the biggest spring in the Black Hills. That's from Perry Ron's Springs of the Black Hills book, pretty well authenticated. And it was also where they kept the spawner fish. There are a tremendous number of fish produced here. Annenberg put in a great fish hatchery and rearing situation, continued to sell fish into spearfish as LaPlante had done, and Granddad took it over when he came in. And the spawners, those great big rainbow trout, were in this pond right back here. And Lyle Hare, I remember one of your great presentations from the senior center of the 2 doctors' hair. And I knew both Lyle and Helen Jane. And she was our dermatologist, and Dr. Hare was just a great friend. But anyhow, Dr. Hare had fishing rights. He also, one of the few who did, he also practiced up at St. John's Hospital in Deadwood. And he brought the nurses out to fish one time. So they got them down in the spawner pond where those great big lunkers were. Now in those days, the Catholic nurses were nuns and they wore those habits. Now here's a picture for you, and you're going to have to do it in your minds because there's not a photograph in existence of those nuns out there with their habits tucked into gumboot waders, pulling out fish with the biggest smiles on their faces. The other thing that was interesting, that's a beautiful, you can't see it now, that's a beautiful white sand bottom there where that water comes up. And it started getting overgrown with moss, so we still worked horses at the ranch, so I can remember they dropped the water down as far as they could and took a dump rake and a team of horses, and they were dragging that rake through. They'd get as much moss as they could pull, trip the rake and then go on, and then they'd pull it up toward the cabins on the other side just to get the moss out. Of just some of those things that fascinating memories for me, may be just overly told history for you folks, but I sure remember it well. When this property was transferred to the state of Wyoming, pursuant to Act of Congress and Fish and Wildlife was through with it, there was a reversionary clause in there. If we added so much as a tool shed or used it for anything except educational or environmental activities, it reverted to the feds. And that was a sort of Damocles hanging over our head, or an albatross around our necks, whatever you want to call it. And I watched that bill as it went through, and I repeatedly tried to get the sponsors to take that part out, or even moving one word, and I don't remember, and it's irrelevant, one word moved 2 words over would have made it livable. Couldn't get it done. And talked to one of the South Dakota delegation was involved in it as well, because School of Mines was the primary tenant, and still is. They're our anchor tenant. They run 3 to 5 geology school sessions here a year, summer. And so anyhow, I talked to one of Dashiell's aides later. He said it never did make any sense to me, but they said it's got to be in, so it's in there. Well, this last session before Congress, our Congresswoman, now retired Cynthia Lummis, got it on in the House, and then it went through quite handily in the Senate. It's going to open up great opportunities for us. You'll see when you get up to the barn, I'll show you a little bit about what we're doing up there, what we plan to do. When Mark makes his presentations, he'll tell you a little bit about the maintenance that we're constantly working on. I do have to tell you a few things before I turn it over. About some facts that aren't so. Al Capone was not here. Al Capone went to federal prison in 1932, the same year they started building this. And it's well documented in here, legacy, that his henchman, Frank Nitti, tried to kill Annenberg and missed by a minute and a half. The train pulled out just before the gunman got there. So I doubt very much that he was a house guest, even if he'd been able to. Now, the National Geographic, October 1926, picture of, taken from right up there, looking down here, Dad and his wife entertaining, and that was covered fairly extensively in the Black Hills book. The text on this was written by Leland Case, and I have not seen that excellent library up at Black Hills State, but the Leland Case Library, I'm told, is outstanding, and he wrote this article back to the historic Black Hills. Some more facts that aren't so. Al Capone wasn't here. His brother was in the Black Hills. And you gotta be a real trivia nut for this one. Al Capone's brother was a federal agent. He shed his name. He adopted the name Richard James Hart. He was an Indian agent on the Cheyenne River Reservation. He was part of Calvin Coolidge's security detail on the Black Hills visit in 1927, and he died of a heart attack at Homer, Nebraska in 1952. Just an amazing link there, and apparently he was as effective chasing crooks as his brother was at being one, because he's credited with, when they transferred him up to the Spokane Reservation in Washington, somewhere during that, he's credited, according to a biography I just checked yesterday, he's credited with arresting 20 known killers. He was a very colorful, interesting fellow. That brings me to something, and this is a bit of a digression from Ranch A. But when you think about where we live and how some of us may take it for granted, I know I did till I grew up enough and got around to know the difference. Calvin Coolidge spent the summer here in 27. He was on his way to re-election to the highest office in the world. Slam dunk re-election, no question. He'd spent 6 weeks in the Black Hills, or more. He was going back to Washington that wasn't near the swamp it is today. And there ain't any doubt in my mind, he looked at that. He was from New England, which is kind of like our part of the world, and he was going back to Washington. And before he left the Black Hills, he said, "I do not choose to run for President of the United States in 1928. Who wants to do it? Now think of that, what we have right here. Okay, I've already covered that he was in spearfishing off Beulah where he had the trout. There was never 2,000 acres in Ranch A. You'll see that in some of the literature. One of the things we're going to do is go back through and build a documents of Ranch A and show these things. The deeds will be one of them. The inventory that Edwin Rounds did in this, that's in this, and you can have copies of it if you're interested, is there. And if Annenberg came out here on the train to Aladdin, as some accounts say, it was in the less than a year after he bought it, because that train from Belfouche to Aladdin was shut down in 28, and construction here was started in 32. So I've taken up enough of your time. I hope some of it was interesting. Mark Burkitts is going to tell you something about his involvement. Dad was hired to come up here by the Fish and Wildlife Service because they said, "Mr. Smith, this is going to seem a little strange, but we don't have the blueprints and we don't know how to turn the water on here." I'm my phrasing, but he came up to spend 6 months helping him get started, and ended up spending 6 years there. He and Leo, I think, worked together on some of the construction projects. But Mark said that if it hadn't been for Dad helping him when he took over as our caretaker, he'd have been pretty lost too. Incidentally, you notice how well groomed this place is, and it's normally shut down. That's to take care of you folks. Thank you for that one. And Mark, if you'd take over now.